Mr. President, what's the parliamentary situation now?
The Senate is considering the motion to proceed to S-3369, the DISCLOSE Act.
And senators are permitted to speak on the previously agreed upon time, or just permitted to speak?
There is no time.
Well, Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about the DISCLOSE Act, which we are debating here on the floor of the United States Senate. I have been involved in this issue of campaign finance reform since I first entered politics, since I first became involved in the political discourse of our country in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a long time ago now. And in now 27 years as a member of the United States Senate, I have seen this debate over money in American politics. I've seen it endure its highs, and I've seen it endure its lows. I was looking back in history, and I can remember the time back in 1990 when we summoned 59 votes in the Senate, mostly Democrats, which will tell you a lot about this issue, 4 Republicans, Senator Cohen of Maine, Senator Jeffords of Vermont, Senator McCain of Arizona, who is still here, still fighting on this issue, and Senator Pressler from South Dakota. And we passed a restraint on spending in American politics, a balanced bill which would have in fact required disclosure, limitations on spending with certain ability of people to be able to be held harmless if people were millionaires and spent extraordinary amounts of money. It made the playing field in America fair. And it gave the best opportunity for the American citizen, about whom this entire exercise is supposed to be focused. It gave the American citizen an opportunity to know that they weren't going to be bombarded with unbelievable amounts of money that distort the American political debate. And we thought that we had a chance, but unfortunately that bill was vetoed by the president. And it's not a coincidence that only 4 Republicans supported that bill. It's not a coincidence today, as we come to the floor of the United States Senate, that maybe no Republican, or very few, I think it is a fair way to say it, will be willing to vote that we ought to disclose where money comes from. We're not even here seeking a limitation on the amount of spending. We ought to be, but we're not. We're here simply trying to get the American people to have the right to know who's giving the money, who is paying these millions of dollars in order to affect the debate in America. And in most cases, I will tell you frankly, to distort the debate. I believe that the amount of money in American politics today is stealing America's democracy. It is robbing Americans of the right to have the kind of representation and the kind of discussion that Americans deserve. When I was first here back in 1985, we were working with people like Bill Bradley from New Jersey and David Boren from Oklahoma, and Joe Biden, now the vice president, obviously, and George Mitchell, the former majority leader and senator from Maine, all of whom were dedicated to trying to take the big money out of politics and replace it with a public match for Senate and for House races. Fundamentally, the status quo won. The status quo stopped us, and the status quo is winning today. After the soft money scandals, maybe people have forgotten, we had our scandals in the 1990s, and so we finally passed the McCain-Feingold bill in response to that, modest as it was, because all it did was limit put a ban on soft money, the soft money, which is the big amounts of money that get poured into the political system. And that ban had the unintended consequence of pushing everybody to look for the biggest loophole that they could find. And they found a loophole, and the 527 groups, as we grew to know them, came out, and the debate was again taken away from the candidates and given to outside groups that had huge amounts of money. A lot of Americans aren't aware of that. The candidate can be running and have one thing that the candidate wants to actually say, but you can have outside groups come in with enormous amounts of money that completely flood the ability of a candidate to control the message of that particular campaign and certainly have a profound impact on it. Never did we imagine then, however, that with one decision, the Supreme Court would tilt the voice of our democracy and our discourse so heavily in the favor of large, unaccountable interests at the expense of the average American. And that, my friends, is what happened when the Supreme Court made the Citizens United decision, which is certainly the worst decision in 100 years, if not more. And what we're talking about today is a system that is simply as broken, as fundamentally broken as the campaign system in our country has ever been. And I worry personally deeply about what it has done to our ability to be able to govern in the public interest and what it does today to threaten the ability of this institution to function. In explaining why she is leaving the United States Senate, our Republican colleague, Senator Snowe, wrote that this body is not living up to what the Founding Fathers envisioned. She spoke of our Founding Fathers' vision for the Senate, where we could reach consensus in an orderly manner. Well, there's nothing orderly, and there's no consensus. Does anyone believe that we could make that kind of Senate occur today, given the kind of campaign finance system that we have, where all of our time, or a huge amount of our time, is a fairer way to say it, is spent raising money? I've heard the majority leader complain that they can't have senators here Mondays, Fridays, other periods of time, because everybody is governed by the campaign schedule. And now we have secret donors who blow candidates out of the water with on-air distortions that are simply mind-boggling. I lived through many of those distortions in 2004 when I ran for president, and I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the power of the lie with a lot of money put behind it, Mr. President. I don't think anybody here could believe that the amount of money in the system today doesn't have the ability to drown out the voices of people who get into public service in order to get things done, but who don't have that kind of money and don't have access to that kind of money. And frankly, the fundamental reason why there's such a disparity between the numbers of Democrats who want to have a fair playing field and the numbers of Republicans who vote against campaign finance reform is, obviously, they have a lot more money. Corporations have a lot more money. Big billionaires who don't want to be taxed in a fair way in America have a lot more money to throw at the system. So you have one guy out in Las Vegas who can put millions of dollars behind a candidate for president and keep a candidacy alive where normally it would have died long ago. The only life it had was the money. And that's what happens today. And that is not what the Founding Fathers intended for this institution. Ours is a system where billions of dollars can be spent by any millionaire or billionaire or the largest corporations in the world to distort our democracy, diminish the voices of candidates, pollute our airwaves with spending whatever and whenever, and the average American doesn't even get to know where the money's coming from. They have the ability in the United States of America to do it secretly. Secret money. The sources are unspecified. And the American people don't know who's behind that. I think that's an insult to the freedom that every senator extols the virtues of all the time in this Senate, It's an insult to the notion about our liberty and our equality and our fairness. It violates the rules of honorable discourse and debate, and it's a threat to every single public servant running for office today in this nation, because it means their ideas can be drowned by the dollars. The United States of America, I got an email the other day from somebody in another country who emailed me and said, you guys are beginning to look like the oligarchies of the world, where the amounts of money buy anything that they want. The increased influence of special interest money, big money in our politics, is robbing the average citizen of their ability to be able to set the agenda. And the agenda is set by the money, because the money is what runs the campaigns. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling in the Citizens United, all any CEO or billionaire has to do is turn over billions of dollars to somebody who goes out and runs a media campaign. Mr. President, Senator McCain, as we all know, feels passionately about this issue, and he recently said, quote, I think there will be scandals associated with the worst decision of the United States Supreme Court in the 21st century. And I agree with Senator McCain. There already are scandals, but not everybody sees them. But I'll tell you this, a lot of senators know exactly what they are. It will result, this unbalance that we have today, imbalance, will result in escalating media wars, where candidates are reduced to mere proxies in the process. And somewhere at some time, those winning candidates are going to be asked to pay up on some special interest need, or toe the line to an agenda that is set by a kind of new terror that enters into our politics. All you have to do is think about the trajectory that we're on today. Will Rogers once said that politics has gotten so expensive that it takes a lot of money to even get beat with. Well, that's never been more true. Will Rogers would be stunned by the amount of money in politics today. In 2008, a record total of $5.2 billion was spent in the presidential, Senate, and House races. That broke the 2004 record, the year I ran, of $4.1 billion. And that broke the 2000 record of $3.1 billion. In other words, every single year, more and more money. But now, in 2010, in the first campaign after Citizens United, there was a fourfold increase in the expenditures from super PACs and other outside groups compared to 2006. Fourfold increase in a 2-year period of time. Anonymous spending rose from 1% of the outside spending to 44% in a 2-year period of time. That's what you get when the Supreme Court of the United States rules in a 5-4 decision, one vote, that corporations and big interests have the same rights to speech as individuals. I mean, it's stupefying to think about it. A corporation. I remember from law school that a corporation was a fictitious entity. A fictitious entity created to create a veil of protection for the people who form it in order to permit commerce in America. Nobody ever created a corporation with the notion that it would have the same rights as a person. Corporations don't get married, they don't have kids, they don't cry. Sometimes, I suppose, when Wall Street falls apart, few people may, but they certainly don't. The notion that somehow a corporation is going to have the same rights of people is an insult to the drafters of the Constitution of our country. And the corollary that somehow they therefore get to spend the same amount of money in an election cycle as an individual. As a result, we are now seeing a spending blitz by shadowy groups. It's projected to reach billions of dollars, money that's impossible to trace to its source, money that's kept in the shadows, away from the average American's ability to even ask who's paying the bills for those ads, who's behind those ads, whose interests do those ads represent. The sums of money we're talking about will mean little to the corporations compared to what they may get in return. And that's what this is all about. Blocking legislation, blocking a regulation, preventing a change in the tax law that takes away a preference that has no relationship to today's economy. There are hundreds of examples, and I've seen them through the years, where money drives the agenda of the United States Congress and of our politics way in excess of what it ought to be when you measure it against the real concerns of the average family trying to make ends meet or find a job in America. Today, we will have a vote on a bill, a vote that ought to go unopposed by any member of this institution who swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And this vote could go a long way towards making the fight between the public interest and the corporate interest, if not fair, at least transparent. It doesn't mean the money's going to stop, but at least let the average American know who's behind the ad, whose money and whose interest is at stake. Because the American people are smart, and given that opportunity, they'll begin to make some judgments about exactly what's at stake. The DISCLOSE Act is not an act to amend the Constitution. It doesn't even overturn the Supreme Court decision that equated the right of corporations to people. Nor does it constitute campaign finance reform. It's none of those things. Those would be structural solutions. Frankly, I'm for them. I think we ought to do them. I think we need a constitutional amendment at this point in order to rectify what the Supreme Court has had difficulty discerning. But all the DISCLOSE Act would do is shed light on who's giving money. Transparency. It ought to receive unanimous support, Mr. President. It's an effort to shine the disinfectant of sunlight on corporations and faceless organizations trying to buy and bully their way into influence in Washington through campaigns that are run against the members who disagree with them. And all you need to do is look at the amount of money that's been spent against some of our colleagues who are running this year, millions of dollars dumped in anonymously in these states to try to affect those races. The DISCLOSE Act requires corporations, organizations, and special interest groups to stand by their political advertising just like a candidate for office does. That's all it requires. A CEO will need to identify himself or herself in the advertisement, and the corporation and organization will be required to disclose their political expenditures. What could be more normal in America? What could be more American than allowing the American people to know who's trying to speak to them? I don't think it's radical, and I don't think it's prohibitive. It simply removes the fallacy that Americans are voluntarily somehow organizing to pursue some public interest. That's a farce. That's not what's happening in these instances. The truth is, Americans aren't organizing or mobilizing to bring you the vast percentage of the advertisements that are seen on TV. The truth is, corporate special interest money is being compiled and targeted to pursue a special interest and send a loud, televised message to those who disagree with them that they're going to be punished and tempered. And not only is it going to tip elections, Mr. President, it is going to cripple the legislative process. When the Citizens United decision was handed down, the voices that were seeking corporate largesse said at that time it's not going to have any impact. And they said we need not worry about funneling new funds to candidates. But the truth is that Karl Rove has admitted that based on the Citizens United decision, he's formed two new groups to influence the 2010 elections with $52 million worth of ads bankrolled anonymously by special interests. And now that the Supreme Court has opened that door to these anonymous ads, similar groups are already planning to spend approximately $300 million on the election this fall. So whether or not you agree with the message that those ads and organizations are sending, at a minimum, you ought to support the idea that the messages ought to be sent openly and that those who send them ought to be held accountable. This ought to be something, as I've said before, that every United States senator supports. Mr. President, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I have the privilege of trying to press our interests in many different parts of the world. I meet with people in various parts of the world who look back at us and ask a lot of questions of us about our democracy. Increasingly, people are asking whether the United States of America can deliver. Increasingly, people are looking at us incredulously and questioning our political system because we go to the brink over a default on the debt ceiling, or because we can't get a budget passed, because we don't do the fundamental business. And one of the fundamental reasons, one of the most profound reasons that we don't do that, and I've seen it change here, is that the power of the money, the power to influence the election, has a profound impact on what colleagues are prepared to take up, what they're prepared to vote on, and how they are prepared to vote. The money, it's a dollarocracy that is beginning to call the shots. And the American people know it. And that's why they're so disappointed in what is happening or not happening in Washington, D.C. That's why the ratings for the United States Congress is so low, because it doesn't produce, it can't produce, it won't produce. And the money almost guarantees that. This is not a new fight in our country, Mr. President. It is not a new fight. Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, fought this fight in the early 1900s. And he took on the great, quote, malefactors of wealth, and he took on the concentration of power, and he was the great trust buster. And it was an extraordinary period of time in America confronting power. And here's what Teddy Roosevelt said back in 1910 in Osawatomie, Kansas. He said, "The Constitution guarantees protections to property, and we must make that promise good. But it does not give the right of suffrage to any corporation." He urged his listeners again and again to demand, and especially national restraint upon fair money-getting, as he called it, unfair money-getting. And the absence of that restraint, he noted, has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power. What Teddy Roosevelt said in 1910 is perhaps even more true today. And the reason is, during the 1990s and subsequently, we have created greater wealth in America than during the period when we did not have an income tax. People today are wealthier comparatively than the Pierponts, Morgans, the Rockefellers and Carnegies and the Mellons and all of those names, famous names of the 1900s that helped to build this country. Today, the wealth far exceeds that wealth, far exceeds it. And the disparity between the average American and the wealthy has grown wider and wider than at any other time in American history. And while the American average family sees their incomes getting squeezed and going down, the upper 1% has seen 10 and 20 and 30 times increases in their income. And that's what's playing out on the American political system today in this Citizens United decision. All we ask today, though we ought to be asking for more, we know we can't get it now, but at least we ought to be able to get the ability of the American people to know who's putting the money into the system, who's trying to affect these votes, who's trying to set the agenda, whose interests are really at stake. That's what's at stake in this vote today, and I hope all our colleagues will vote for the right to disclose those funds to the American people who have an inalienable right to know exactly where it's coming from.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, earlier today, our colleague from Washington State indicated that President Obama and the Democratic leadership in Congress are willing to accept the largest tax increase in American history and a series of crippling defense cuts unless Republicans will agree to raise taxes. significantly falling on the very people that we're counting on to get our economy going again and to create jobs. I want to say just a few words in response. First of all, senators on both sides of the aisle understand that a massive tax increase could well push our economy back into a recession. Senators on both sides of the aisle understand that it would suffocate our investments that are so important to business creation and job growth. Senators on both sides of the aisle understand that middle-class families are already struggling with high unemployment and wage stagnation. And senators on both sides of the aisle understand that we're living through the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. And yet, President Obama and his party seem obsessed with raising taxes on the very people who are responsible for most of that new job creation. Led by the president, these same people are demonizing business owners and demanding that they be punished, while simultaneously demanding that these same people create jobs. It's no wonder that so many Americans are concerned about the future of the United States economy. Meantime, Democratic leaders like our colleague from Washington State are apparently ready to stand by and allow truly draconian, across-the-board defense cuts, even though the Secretary of Defense, the President's own Secretary of Defense, has said these cuts would hollow out our military and be catastrophic to our national security. It simply amazes